Welcome to Boss Talk. My name is Jim Parker. This is my business partner, Carey Sobel.
Today's episode is called No Such Thing as a Clean Closing. So picture this. We've just closed. Everything was so easy. There were no hiccups along the way. We're signed, sealed, delivered. Buyers happy, sellers happy, money's transferred, and everything is immaculate. That will never happen. Ever.
Yeah, right.
Am I right or am I
No,
right?
yeah, that's pretty much the truth.
There is literally something that happens in every single deal that I can possibly think of, from a couple weeks before closing to well after post-closing, where an issue comes up. Not to say it's one that can't be resolved or whatever, but there's no such thing as a clean closing.
Yeah, no, and I gotta say, I think for the most part, I mean, almost every transaction that we do, from beginning to end, it's going. I think it goes pretty smoothly, and we know what we're doing. We know what obstacles we need to face. We know how to overcome them. But there are things that just pop up that you cannot expect, and you don't know. And those are the things you need to adjust to, and you need to make those things. You need to correct those things.
Well, they say, you make a mistake, you learn from it, right? So I can't tell you how many scars we have, and our closing coordinator has all over our bodies from things we've experienced that we didn't know would be obstacles, we didn't think could be concerns. And as long as we learn from them and add them to our ever-evolving closing checklist, we just get a little bit better each time.
You know what, Carey? On that point, I'm going to tell you, when I used to instruct brokers for the Business Brokers of Florida and the IBBA, I would say to the new brokers, I would say, you do like 10 transactions and you're going to feel like you're going to have a really good understanding of how this industry works. Mm-hmm. When you get done with about 25,
you want to quit.
You're going to realize you don't know anything.
Yeah.
And we've got hundreds underneath of our belt now. Yeah. And you're right. You just keep adding that information and it just makes it even better. But no matter what, there's going to be things that pop up because there's personalities involved. There's a lot of there's lenders, there's attorneys, there's CPAs, there's insurance companies. There's just so many different parties involved.
And so many things that could go wrong that, rare. I've had one deal that was last August that's coming up on the anniversary of it. And I know that because I just bought a gift, 1-year anniversary gift for my seller. It's probably the smoothest closing I've ever had. And there were still issues with it. Now, hiccups of just delays or this or that. But one of the smoothest closings I've ever had, still with a couple oh crap moments.
Yeah.
And, things have changed along the way. Like one of the notes that I wrote down here was a lot of closings don't happen in person anymore. Whereas every closing was happening in person. People were flying from around the country to be at a table. There's no DocuSign, like everything was getting done at a closing table. Whereas now I'd say it's more common than not to do virtual closings.
I can't remember the last time. I mean, the last time I sat at a closing table was probably before COVID.
Was it?
Yeah.
You haven't had one since then?
I don't think I've had one since then. No, because everything now is done electronically.
I've still had quite a few in person, and I always encourage it when we can, just because, especially if buyer and seller have a real good relationship and maybe they've never met in person or have only met once or twice. There's a little celebration to be had. But I would say more times than not, closings are done through DocuSign. And it's funny because on the DocuSign ones, you have more missed signatures or incorrect entity names and other mistakes that happen more so with the electronic closings than they did in person.
Oh, see, this is where me and you are going to be against each other on, because I really like the electronic signature situation. I mean, for me, I haven't seen any increase in mistakes or a decrease in mistakes on the documents at all. And, the documents go out a week ahead of time, so everybody has the time to review them. And, part of the process is that once we go under contract, we're having weekly or bi-weekly phone calls between, the buyer, the seller, and my team. And, sometimes the SBA lender gets on the call as well. So there's communication going all the way through. And to me, you show up at the closing table, it's kind of like anticlimactic.
It is.
You got to sit around the table and you're signing all these documents, and people, you really can't talk. It's just kind of like passing documents back and forth and people signing and it's not really, I don't know, it's anticlimactic where
it is.
Now we do it. Okay, do it by DocuSign. Everybody's already looked at the documents. We usually have the buyer and the seller, usually talk the day before as well. Then the day happens, they sign in the morning, and then the buyer's, driving over to the business after the signatures are done.
Yep.
And So I don't know.
No, I'm with you on that. Look, any way you can leverage technology to save time is great. So
Yeah.
I have no problem with the closings. It's easier for us, but I don't mind the in-person ones. But one thing I think that's pretty common is rarely ever do you put a closing date on the LOI or asset purchase agreement, and we actually hit that target date. And even if we do, most times we don't, and it's because we're delaying it. So closing delays are common, and I think buyers and sellers should prepare themselves to rarely hit that target date. So let's talk about some of the reasons why closing delays happen. I think the biggest one is probably third party assignments. If we're doing a transaction, and whether we're representing buyer, seller, or both, or whatever, if there is a third party in it, whether it be a franchisor, whether it be a landlord, or anybody else that has any governance over any aspect of that deal that is not in the deal,
Mhm.
right? They're not, time is of the essence. They're on their own time. We can call them up and say, hey, Mr. Landlord or Mrs. Landlord, we're getting ready to close. We've been waiting to close for a while. Can you please just take this one tenant in this one strip center out of the 30 that you own across America and focus your attention on it so we can meet our closing date? You think they care about that?
Yeah.
Absolutely not.
Right.
So third party assignments, lease, franchisor, any third party signatures that have anything to do at all with the transaction is one of the main reasons I see closings being delayed.
Yeah. Yeah.
Another one is title, UCC, or compliance issues. So this comes in the form of, vehicles being transferred over. If you have UCCs on equipment, a lot of times if you're a business owner and you purchased equipment or financed equipment and you pay it off, a lot of times that equipment provider doesn't release the lien.
Oh, that gets on my nerves.
And it happens a lot.
I think that should be a law that they have to remove it. I mean, look, you go out and get a loan, and these companies throw the lien down so quickly, and they throw a lien down so quickly, but then the business owner pays off that lien, and then 2 years later, that lien is still out there. Like,
Yeah.
I think it should be a law
It
that
should
if you're
be.
putting a lien on something because there's a loan going on, when that loan is paid off, that lien needs to be removed in 30 days,
Mhm.
60 days, 90 days. 2 years later? Yeah.
But I mean,
And then you have to track down, like you said, you have to track down that company.
What if
you have
that
to get them to
company's out of business?
Remove the lien, and it's a headache.
And there have been times where it was actually an equipment company that went out of business and they still had an active lien on it. And we eventually got around it because we could show that the business was insolvent. But, that type of thing happens. I've actually did a deal recently where there was a SBA lien that was active, even though the note was paid off.
Bank lien?
A bank lien, but, it was an SBA finance deal, but bank
Yeah.
lien for a deal that was paid off 2 years prior. They just never released it. Of course, once you get in contact and through all the red tape and everything, you can get it removed. But these are just hiccups that come up. And, sometimes liens are missed, UCCs are missed, and maybe they're reran and they come up or something. Maybe they're applying for credit somewhere. But, typically a third-party closing attorney, if they're administrating a transaction, it's their responsibility to make sure that the business doesn't have any encumbrances on it.
Well, to check to see if
check
to see if there's any liens, and then we have to go from there.
And if there are, they'll typically notate us as brokers, and we'll tell our seller, and the seller will work on getting liens released or title clear. Sometimes it can be as deep as compliance from tax from your county or city, or it's similar to like an HOA for a home, but things where people can grasp onto a business because the business was not in compliance, or it could be related to environmental, anything that there was a third party control over that business that seller did or didn't know about could typically delay closing.
Yeah. I mean, things like payoff letters, the seller has a loan on vehicles, and they're going to be paid off on the day of closing. You have to get a payoff letter from that company to provide to the closing attorney to get the deal closed. So anything like that,
Let's talk a little bit more about how that works. So let's say business owner is selling their business and they have outstanding debts, considerable amount.
Mm-hmm.
And the seller is planning to utilize the funds from closing to pay off several of those debts. The business is closing on the 18th of the month. And coincidentally, all of those debts are typically due on the 1st, just for the purposes of this illustration. Well, let's say it's 4 different companies. Seller's going to call and say, I need a payoff. as of this date with a per diem, which is the
Yeah.
cost per day to keep that financing going on, because the business has to be sold free and clear.
Yeah.
So any of those liens that those companies have on that business have to be free and clear, but you're not going to pay it off before you get the money.
Right.
So it all has to happen at the same time.
Mm.
So these closing agents or attorneys that are representing buy or sell side have to coordinate all those different types of things. And it can be down to a per diem of 18 days of financing for equipment, 4 or 5 different companies, 4 or 5 different payoffs. And then on that closing statement, it shows the money being routed from the seller getting their funds and then rerouted right back to those people to pay it off.
And you go to that, you're right. And you go to that. A couple years ago, I had a 14 shop location business that we had to get 14 leases transferred. And that was a nightmare trying to coordinate all that, and we ended up, it was hard dealing with all 14. And there was a couple that were like really difficult to work with. And they were so difficult that we had to go back, that extended closing. Then we had to go back and we had to do like the first 5 or 6, get them again for the first 5 or 6, because it had fallen outside the date range that was on there. So it's just little things like that.
I had a similar one to that too. It was a 18 chain quick service restaurant. And I remember when we tackled it with our closing coordinator and our other partner, Tony, and we were like, okay, you're going to take these 6, you're going to take these 6, you're going to take these 6, and we're going to report back every Friday. Some of them were so cooperative and some of them were so difficult. Yeah. Literally, even the day that we closed on it, there was one that still would not comply, and we still closed the deal and just made like a special arrangement. But my God. And those are the things that when we sit down and talk to a business owner and they question our worth or our how much we're making, is like, these are the things that they are not thinking about.
Yeah.
So
there's a lot.
For no such thing as a clean closing, talking about third-party assignments and delays. We have on here too delays from attorneys and CPAs, and well-meaning advisors may often overcomplicate things.
Yeah, well, not only that, but you might be running into a situation with a CPA that, the buyer wants to use their CPA, or we need information from the seller's CPA, and you're in the midst of tax season. It's March 31st, tax season's ending in a couple weeks, and they're swamped.
Yeah.
So and the buyer's trying to do due diligence, or the seller's trying to collect information from their CPA, or we're trying to get updated P&Ls from the seller. I mean, all that stuff that CPA is still worried about 2020, the year before.
Yeah.
We're trying to get updated financials for this year. So you run into that problem. Or, this happens too when you have closings around the end of the year. That makes it more difficult too, because you got closing that's like December 15th, and then this attorney is on vacation, and then that attorney's on vacation, and then this person is gone, and then that person's gone, and they might only be gone for 2 or 3 days here and 2 or 3 days there, but that all adds up when you've got 8 people in the
domino effect is real.
Transaction. So,
and on the attorney point too, I think a lot of times people that practice law, or attorneys that practice law that's not business law, or specifically closings, come in and focus so much more on risk than they do on getting a deal closed. And they're taking boilerplate standard state contracts that they're trying to mark up and get extra dollars and cents out of their client than they are focused on getting the deal closed. So for us, we're trying to wrangle like a circus, all these different people to stay focused on getting a deal closed. Everybody's got their own agenda. So we can only control what we can control.
Yeah.
And so it's difficult, especially when third parties have control. But one of the categories we had in here was last minute surprises during due diligence. And it doesn't even necessarily need to be last minute. Let's talk about due diligence surprises, right? One big one that I see is unreported debts, where there will be a creditor or something that hears about a transaction. Maybe it wasn't a part of the due diligence because they didn't know it existed. They hear about a transaction. They go, oh, I have an outstanding check for $585. Might be nominal in the grand scheme of things, but this type of stuff comes up. The worst is lawsuits in due diligence when they pop up, because you don't necessarily see all of the lawsuits when you do a search, and sometimes they'll pop up ironically. Sometimes they'll pop up because they learn about a sale. Have you had that happen?
I've never had that happen. Neither one of those, actually.
The issue that I see the most is lease issues. But I've seen expired licenses. and things just like that.
I think it's really important that a business owner in the very, very beginning, when they first have a conversation with us or whatever business intermediary they're thinking about working with, that they're disclosing things about their business up front. The
Of
worst
course.
thing you want to have happen is the buyer to find out about that in due diligence.
Mhm.
Buyer finds out on that in due diligence, you're losing that likability, you're losing that trustworthiness, you know?
Yeah.
And so let's wash that out in the beginning.
We talked about that in a lot of different episodes about letting the skeletons out of the closet in the beginning, but those that don't, this is when they come up.
And sometimes I think the seller doesn't even realize that it's a skeleton or an obstacle until you start having those conversations with them and you're talking to them and you're like, oh, that's an obstacle.
Yeah.
Oh, it is?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Like it's
So
it's not intentional.
why?
But
Yeah, it's not intentional.
Yeah. We have a couple different other sections to talk about that I guess we're going to kind of work backwards, because we wrote down that post closing for a business is so much different than post closing when you're selling a home.
Yes.
There's so many different topics and things to talk about. We rush to get a deal done. And when I say rush, we're just trying to expedite to get closed, right? Not necessarily rush in a negative connotation. The amount of ahas that we have after a deal finally gets done are superseded by the amount of stuff that we have to take care of post closing.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's a good point. When you buy a house or you sell a house, it's usually all taken care of on that day of closing. Everybody signs the paperwork, you're done, the seller's walking away, the buyer gets the keys to the home, the transaction's done. Unless there's a major problem, the buyer and the seller are never talking again, and the real estate agents are out of it for the most part. When you sell a business, it's not wrapped up so nice and neat when you get done. You
No.
just don't. It's there's a lot of things that you cannot do before closing that you must do after closing that have to be taken care of.
Let's talk about 'em.
Either because you're trying to keep the confidentiality of the business, or you just can't do them until the buyer actually owns the business.
Yeah. And that's, I think we can illustrate some of those pretty clearly. I think the biggest one is, confidentiality. So, breaking the news to the staff.
Yes.
I
Yes.
think the biggest one is you're constantly trying to hide the fact that the business is sold. Business sells, and the first step is, all right, it's sold. There's a new owner. The new owner is going to be in that business next day. We have to go tell the staff.
What's the announcement? How's the announcement going to look like? How are we going to handle that?
Sometimes, key members of the staff are maybe told before. I always say no.
I always say no.
No matter
Yeah,
what. No matter what.
I on a very rare occasion we'll do with key employees for
Yeah.
But for the most part, don't like it, don't want to do it. Those are very special cases.
And
that we're
when
doing
this
that.
happens, usually because buyer and seller typically ask us what to do, and I always say I think that the most important thing is call a meeting. Say it's an important meeting. Buyer and seller should both be there. Seller should talk about why they were selling and gratitude for everything that's happened and why it had to be confidential, et cetera, what they're doing with the future, et cetera. Buyer comes in and talks about look forward to working with everyone, encouraging that there's not going to be crazy change. Everything's going to be okay. I look forward to
Yeah.
getting to know you.
If anything, we're going to improve it for all of
yeah.
us. And
That emotional aspect and, opening up the shade and showing everyone what's been going on, I think for buyer and seller is the biggest post-closing item for us as brokers. We're just there as a coach. Our job is done, right?
Yeah.
So that's way different than, the sign that was on the front of the house that said for sale that then said sold. And when the sign's gone, guess what? The new buyer of that home is probably living in there and all the neighbors know it.
Yeah.
There is no sign when you're selling a business. So other post-closing items, there's a lot of changeovers and transfers.
yeah, that's probably a huge one too, Carrie, is that you can't change things over like the electricity, the phone, the water, merchant services. You can't change over all these services, because but if the thing doesn't close for some reason, I mean, but if like the day before the closing, the buyer, and I don't want to sound
Gets
negative.
hit by a car.
I don't want to say negative. He gets hit by a bus or a car. Let's say he wins the lottery. He wins $300 billion in the lottery, and he's not going to close, and he takes off around the world, and you never talk to him again. How are you going to get those utilities transferred back?
Yeah.
And in a bad case, what happens if he does get in an accident?
Yeah.
Or, if for some reason the deal does go south, usually there's not going to be a lot of good relationship between the seller and
Yeah.
the buyer. So that makes it hard to transfer that stuff back. none of that stuff should be transferred until post closing.
It's not done till it's done.
Not to mention that you don't want mail showing up at the seller's business before closing with the buyer's name on it or the
Had that
buyer's
happen
corporation name on it. So buyers need to understand too, like when they're filling out their corporate paperwork. Let's say they're doing an asset sale and they're setting up their own corporation and they're going to buy all the assets and goodwill of the seller's corporation, and they put down the address of the business. Well, now you're going to get mail from the state to that business address with the buyer's corporation on it, as well as that it becomes public record in a lot of cases. So now you're getting all these people thinking it's a new business or companies thinking it's a new business, sending mail to the business. So, just things you do not do before closing. Now, in that case, you do have to set up your entity before closing, but you
Use
put
a
down
different
your
address.
attorneys, do a different address. Don't
And
use the company address
We have a lot of them here. I think
for the mailing at
the
least.
easiest one from my perspective is, the utilities, because usually the day of closing, when we talked about familiarization period, buyer and seller sitting down and going through a list. Merchant services is one where I've tried to always time it to where you do some of the paperwork
I do too.
prior.
Yeah.
But in most cases, it's not done on time. And let's say that I'll stop before going down the list. Let's say utilities is missed by a week. And let's say merchant services is missed by a couple days.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's normal.
So in most transactions, we have a holdback of funds. And let's just call it, for most businesses, I use around $25,000 to $50,000. And it's usually about a 45-day period. The reason I do the 45-day period is because most of the monies that are transferred back and forth post-closing is happening within a month cycle, right? So in 45 days after closing, if the buyer does not make a claim to that money that was held back from the seller, then that money is then released to the seller. Why is that money held back? The money is held back in the case that these transitionary items that are customary in a business transaction are not handled responsibly and respectfully between buyer and seller.
Yeah.
Right.
And I think that's the key point is that if a bill comes in post closing, that it's a responsibility of the seller. You don't go to the escrow the person holding the escrow money and saying, "Hey, I want reimbursed for that money." Have the seller reimburse it. You know what I mean? The buyer and the seller should be working together. And if they do have a issue or problem, call your broker, pick up the phone and, we know what's normal, what's not normal. We can't give legal advice, but we know, hey, come on, that's
how it's
your
usually
responsibility, or that's not your responsibility. You're correct. Or let's handle it this way. And we can kind of help mediate it or get that situation resolved without getting attorneys involved.
And a difficult one.
And most buyers, and most of the time, I haven't had
very rarely.
Yeah. I mean, you have little disputes here and there where the buyer and the seller might call you and say, hey, this is happening. What do you think? And you're like, da, da, da. And they're like, okay, it's not a big deal. Don't make it a big deal. You do have the one once in a while where the buyer and the seller, there might be a little bit of this post closing, but I've never had one where they sued each other post closing.
I've never had one suing, but I've had dipping into escrow dollar amounts because of things. And normally it's like normalization of working capital adjustments or something else. And they're just like, just take it from there. But some ones that are easy is like the intangibles, phone, website, social media, you transfer ownership of post-closing, occupational licenses.
Sometimes the social media, you can't do a transfer of ownership. But you just give them admin capabilities because you're not allowed to actually sell that social media. And I want to get back to that merchant service, because that merchant service sometimes might be a couple of days, even if you do the paperwork beforehand.
Yeah.
You don't want the merchant service company coming in before closing. So they're going to come in post closing. So there might be a couple of day delay in there. So what usually happens in that case is the buyer uses the seller's merchant service, runs the credit card machines. He runs the credit cards through the machine. It goes into the seller's account. Then the seller reimburses the buyer for those few days minus the fees.
Yep.
That the merchant service provider charges.
And if they're cooperating, all of this is documented. It's super seamless.
You're keeping track of everything. You're prorating things. Utilities, they might be transferred, like you said, a week later. You're keeping track of this and you're doing prorations. But at the same time, like, don't nickel and dime each other as well. I had a seller a few years ago that was like, before closing, they sent over like a proration list, and it was like, $1.52, 93 cents. I'm like, no. I called them like, no,
we're not doing that.
It's not nickel and dime each other.
I'll pay for that. Just another one's payroll that can be kind of complicated, because payroll is, in most cases every other week or the 1st and the 15th. So We try to time our closings if we can on the 1st or the 15th of the month. And we obviously try to avoid certain days like Fridays. So these types of things will cause prorations of payroll, which can be a little bit more difficult. If they're salaried employees straight line, it's a little bit easier because you can look at what the per diem is. But if they're hourly and they're different pay rates, it can be,
Yeah,
but
it can be cumbersome, but you get
but
through it and you work through it. And it's
absolutely.
not that big of a deal. And you also got to keep in mind things like employee vacation time. If the employees all get a week off at Christmas time and the buyer's buying that business, in August, then the seller is responsible for the paid
Paid time
vacation
off.
time from January, the proration of January 1st until, let's
Mhm.
say, they close on August 15th. You know what I mean?
And those are little
I guess the easiest way to explain that, let's move that date. Let's say we close on June 30th. So you're 6 months in the year, you give off a week of vacation time, then 50%, because we closed halfway through the year, 50% of that vacation time that's paid should be paid by the seller, 50% by the buyer.
and it's just math,
Yeah.
right? It's
It's
going
just
through
math.
everything, and more times than not, there's no disagreement. Um, One of the ones that can be a little bit of a surprise
And
to
you are doing that kind of stuff before closing.
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
one of the things that can be a little bit of a surprise to some buyers is when there's vehicles involved. And after the sale of a business, when you have to go down to the DMV and transfer the vehicles, the buyer is going to pay sales tax on the transfer
Of those
of
vehicles.
those vehicles. And I just did a transaction where that happened. It was like an $19,000 moment where the buyers weren't prepared for that.
Yeah.
But more times than not, we address it ahead of time.
Yeah,
Um,
and that if you got a lot of vehicles, because obviously you had a lot of vehicles, got a lot of vehicles in that situation, and you should be setting up a meeting. Don't just show up down to the DMV trying
yeah.
to trying to transfer 20 vehicles. They're probably not going to do it. You got one or two, yeah, just walk in. You got 10 vehicles, 5 vehicles or more. You got a lot of vehicles. Set up the meeting with the DMV. Let them know you're coming in.
We're probably missing a lot of post closing items. I know a really big one that we won't dive in today is adjustments of networking capital and things
Yeah,
like that. We're not going to talk about that today. But what about transition expectations, right? So I have a lot of times, and we mentioned this in the previous episode, that buyers assume that sellers are going to be their employees during that transition time, right? So there's sometimes misaligned expectations on the transition period.
yeah. That person's there to train you. They're coming in with the knowledge. They don't. You don't. You don't. I mentioned this in another episode that we recorded recently. That this is going back years before the seller called me and was like, "What the heck's going on?" The buyer's like asking me to go get coffee. I'm like, shouldn't be doing that. I had to call the buyer. As the buyer, the seller is not free labor. They're
Yeah.
not there. Oh, I don't have to have an employee there. I can save them my labor for that couple weeks because the owner's going to be there. No, the owner's not there to do actual labor work. They're there to teach and train you how to operate the business and help you transfer things like utilities and, working with your suppliers and that kind of thing.
I had a buyer recently that closed on a business and went out of town the day after closing for a week long vacation
Wow.
and did not do anything for the business, just expected it to continue to operate. And Monday, they were like, the employees got there and like, what's going on? Where's Mr. Seller? Well, Mr. Seller doesn't own the business anymore. Mr. Buyer was out in the West Coast.
Wow.
It
That's
was
crazy.
it was interesting. So, there's definitely some disagreements on how long the seller will stay involved. Sometimes there's actually a new part on the standard contract that we use for our state that actually specifies the amount of hours to work during that familiarization period, because it used to say how many days, month, or weeks or months, and now it says how many hours per day.
Yeah.
So they're looking for that specificity. Now, typically, buyer and seller have a good agreement on what it looks like and what they're going to do, and sellers more times than not wanting to help the buyer versus like, nope, I'm done. But these are some things that could technically.
Yeah, and I think it's important you do that too because if a seller is only working 25 hours a week, they should only be working 25 hours a week post closing, in my opinion.
At
What I mean?
most.
At most, they should be working what they normally work. If they're working Monday through Friday, they shouldn't be working on the weekends.
Mhm.
Post closing.
Yeah. So we talked about post closing, which is different than buying a house. Let's talk a little bit about leading up to closing, right? You know, when we're getting towards closing, everybody's anxious. You're trying to pay attention to all these different things moving along. Uh, when do closing documents come out? When's loans supposed to underwriting finish up? Walk me through a little bit leading up to closing.
Yeah, the closing docs, I like them to come out at least 4 business days prior to closing. I like it to be a little bit longer if possible. Obviously we don't have control of that. We do it to a little bit, but it's up to the attorney at the end of the day, or the attorneys if it's a definitive agreement. I want everybody to have enough time to review everything, before signing it.
Without feeling like they're chasing their tails
Yeah.
or pressure.
And the last couple of weeks before closing, as far as the bank goes, the bank's probably coming back for a few things from the seller and a few things from the buyer, but for the most part, it gets really quiet those last couple of weeks from the lender.
Yeah.
And we're kind of like in a waiting stage for it to come out from underwriting.
So during this time, it's coming out of underwriting. We're hopefully getting our assignment docs. Insurance is getting bound.
Insurance is done. The life insurance, if it's an SBA loan, because the bank's going to be requiring that. And that's something that, our closing coordinators actually instructing buyers to get before the lender
even ask for it.
Yeah. Because life insurance, that can be a problem. Like a lot of times the lenders will be like, oh, you got to get life. They tell the buyer that to get life insurance, but like 2 weeks before closing, they're like, okay, buyer, go get your life insurance now. And the thing is like sometimes it takes 3 weeks to get
longer. I had one that was longer
because the buyer has to get health things done, blood drawn. They might have to get blood drawn and blah, blah, blah. There's questions being asked. So that's something that our closing coordinator, she's great. We've had her move that up, and she's actually most of the time she's asking for that from the buyer before the bank even asking.
Tell the audience why life insurance is involved in buying a business.
Oh yeah. If you got an SBA loan, most of the time the lenders are going to require the life insurance, because if you're taking a $3 million loan and then you get hit by a bus, they're out $3 million. So they want insurance on you in case you get hit by that bus. They're going to get paid off on that business. That's right. Why the life insurance is that way.
There we go. There's walkthroughs and counts, right? If inventory is X amount of inventory is included in sale, and an estimation is put together of a normalized inventory for a seller that is included in the sale of the business. Well, come closing day, maybe it's a year later, chances are that number is going to vary. So if seller said that X amount of inventory was included and it's less, the expectation is that seller is going to either make sure that inventory is there or reduce their purchase price. If there's more inventory there, it's typically up to buyer if they want to buy it, or seller just wants to give it. So we do a walkthrough sometimes before closing if it's an inventory heavy business to make sure those assets are there.
Yeah. Count the inventory, make sure that it's right.
Walking through to just look at the furniture, fixtures, and equipment. Make sure that seller didn't have a garage sale and sell all of their stuff before. I've seen quite a few disputes about an equipment list of things that aren't included. In one case, it was artwork and memorabilia, and that artwork and memorabilia had significant value. And on the asset list, it said various artwork and memorabilia included. Well, it didn't say all, it didn't say some, it just said various. So there was a debate on how much was included. Well, the seller wanted to take all of it because the seller happened to have a memorabilia business in addition to their restaurant. The buyer assumed that they're buying a sports related restaurant with all the memorabilia there. And we didn't go through and name every single one that is and isn't included. Yeah. So they had to come to a consensus, which they did, but that one was challenging.
Yeah. So, and I think the equipment list that goes back, equipment list should be done up front of what's included. There should be another equipment list of things that are not included, and possibly a third list of that's equipment that's not included in the sale,
least,
but will
is available,
probably stay post closing, but it's owned by a third party.
Oh,
you know what I mean? Like you take you take like a restaurant, and the Coke machine and the coolers and stuff like that are owned by the soda companies.
Pool tables, dartboards.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So you're just saying, hey, we don't own this. It's not being transferred, but it's going to stay, as far as we know, it's going to stay at the business.
We have a couple other items leading up to closing, and these are real ones, and these are the ones where we become more of a psychologist than a business broker. But the emotional meltdowns and some cold feet, both on buy and sell side, leading up to closing.
Yeah, there's a lot of emotion.
Sellers often second guess: did I make the right decision? Am I ready to move on? If this has been my identity, what am I going to do? Did I sell for too low? What are my employees going to think? There's a lot of emotional things that a seller gets as they're getting close to closing. And
It's becoming more real for them.
it's becoming more real. And they get sentimental or anxious about letting go. And it becomes a challenge where you need to encourage them why you started this journey.
Yep. And I have those conversations with my sellers very early on before we even list the business. It's like, can you really do this? Are you really mentally ready to do this? And, I had a seller a few years ago that, big burly, I've told you this before, big burly,
Yep. I
blue
remember the
collar,
story.
tough guy, wonderful guy, but he was a man's man, like, big guy. And he was tearing up at the closing table. I had to be like, you want to step outside? And we stepped outside. I'm like, you able to do this? He's like, I want to do it. I'm just, it's been my life.
Yeah.
And he wasn't regretting doing it, but he was tearing up. And this is a guy that you didn't think would ever cry
Yep.
in the world. You know what I mean? And he was tearing up. It's hard.
And on the flip side of like letting go is the buyers getting cold feet about, am I making the right decision? Is this too much risk? Maybe something happened in the business and they're getting apprehensive about moving forward. I've had a couple deals fall apart because buyer backed out last minute, like closing docs are drafted and buyer has backed out.
Yeah.
But 90% of the time, it's just a conversation of here's how you can come to this, and just positive reinforcement and reassurance is what's needed. But we're controlling a lot of emotions as it gets close.
Yeah. And you know what? Going back to what you're saying, this ties into controlling or, working with people with emotions is that, the last couple of weeks before closing, we're kind of waiting on the bank. And that's the time where things are getting quiet with the bank, except for they might be asking for a few things here and there. But that's the time where we're talking about, okay, we talked about before in very general terms how we're gonna talk to the employees. So let's get more in depth of how we're gonna handle talking to the employees, how we're gonna handle with the customers. We're starting to foresee like post closing, how are things gonna be handled?
Mm-hmm.
When are they gonna transfer the utilities? So that's a good time. Like the due diligence is done, everything's at the bank, like the deal's almost done. Now it's time, like, let's start thinking about post closing. And I think that helps the seller and the buyer too start to, bring their emotions back in.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Absolutely. One of the last items that we have written down here is working capital and prorations is something that often stalls deals at the very, very end. So, we're all trying to find out what is going to be the closing date, right? When do we get the final closing document agreed upon between both parties? When do we have our lease? When do we have all of our liens released? When has all of the items on this long checklist been done? And once we land on that target date, well, now we can actually do some of the math. We can go back and we can look at working capital, and we can look at where receivables at. We've decided we're closing next Friday, which is the 5th. And if we're closing on that date, now we have to use that date as how we're going to calculate all these prorations. And that's where sometimes I've seen some arguments happen between buyer and seller. Now, it should clearly be laid out what they agreed upon in the beginning in their LOI or asset purchase agreement. So it really shouldn't change much as it gets closer to closing. But so many variables that could happen from when a business goes under contract to when it closes. I mean, I've seen as much as a year under contract before closing because of delays and issues. So things change. So getting buyer and seller from the first time they meet to closing, there's deal fatigue, and there's so many different things that can influence a buyer or seller being petty, right? So while we didn't cover everything, I think we painted a pretty clear picture of how hard it is to actually get a deal closed, and that everything that we talked about today not happening at all is just not going to happen.
Yeah.
It's never going to happen. So, you brought me into this business, and as I train other people coming into the business, or when people ask me about business brokerage, I tell them it's not for the weak. I said, you got to be patient, and I'm the least patient person I know. But I have an expectation that I now set to other people that there is no such thing as a clean closing.
Yeah.
And you'd agree with that.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. Is when you close, there's going to be a bunch of stuff that's going to need to happen post closing.
Yeah.
It's not going to be tied up into a bow like when you're buying a house or selling a house. Simple
So if
as
I
that.
buy a business, there's not going to be like a bow on it, like a car, like at Christmas time, stuff like that.
And you're all done. There's
Yeah.
post closing. There's going to be a lot of little things that are going to need to be done. And prior to closing, I would say for the most part that I think things go pretty smoothly. I think we really got it down pat
Yeah.
at Boss Group. We got a great closing coordinator, which I don't know of any other company that has a closing. Somebody's dedicated just to closings. I would
Mhm.
put her up against 99% of the brokers out there.
So would I.
And she's got a good systems and process. I think that for the most part, it's really down. It's just there's so many things that need to be done. There's so many different people involved in the process that, little things like here and there pop up. And if the seller is a good person, the buyer is a good person, and the other broker on the other side, if there's another broker involved, is a level head. You work through all this
Yeah.
stuff and you get it done. I don't want people listening to this to be like, oh my gosh, this is going to be crazy. It's not. It's crazy for us. We're behind the scenes. We're, making we're paddling the
We're
paddles.
making the sausage.
We're doing everything, but for the seller, for the most part, there's a lot of stuff that they need to do, but we're trying to take most of that lift off of them. And we're taking a little bit of the lift off the buyer, a good amount off the buyer, but I'm not going to kid anybody. The buyer has a lot to do. The buyer probably
Especially if they're
has
getting
10 times more stuff to do than the seller.
Yeah.
Once we go under contract.
So don't be
And with things that we can't necessarily do.
Right.
Moral of the story is don't be afraid to buy a business. Don't be afraid to sell your business, but prepare yourself that there is no such thing as a clean closing. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Boss Talk. We hope that you are enjoying the content. If you have any topics that you want to hear, reach out to us and let us know. My name is Carey Sobel. This is Jim Parker. We appreciate you guys.
And please visit us at www.bossgi.com. Thank you very much.